When I was 16, I worked in a coffee shop. It was my first job, and I really liked working there. I was a young girl, so I would occasionally get a creepy comment from some random old man. I could sometimes tolerate it because I really needed the paycheck. But this time, it went way too far. I usually work from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and those were long, feverish hours. There were 2 stations to switch between in the coffee shop. One for coffee and pastries, and one for ice cream. So I would be spending hours going back and forth between stations. I would often work with a girl who was in her early 20s named Kelly. She was really pretty and often colored her hair crazy colors, but she had the maturity of a freshman in high school. She wasn't of much help on these long nights despite being supervisor. She had a huge ego for someone who made me do all the work and then expect the tips to be split. For about a week, I noticed the same guy frequenting the place. He'd come in with a laptop, order a hot green tea, and then sit down and browse on the internet for hours. I didn't pay any attention to him at first. About the 3rd day in a row of him coming in, he made small talk with me at the counter. He asked me for my name because I wasn't wearing my name tag. I told him my name, and he smiled and said he knew my mom. I fake smiled and talked all giddy with my customer service voice. He then asked my age. That made me uncomfortable, so I just said I needed to check something in the back. I told Kelly that the customer out there was being creepy and asked if she could take care of him for me. She told me I was being really paranoid, but did me a solid anyway. I sat on my phone for about 10 minutes before going back out behind the counter. Kelly and this guy were laughing and talking like old chums. He seemed to be flirting with her a lot, and then looked up and saw me. He smiled all creepy again, winked, and then turned around to leave. I was disgusted, but decided to get on with my shift. The next day, this guy came back. He ordered his tea and then quietly went to sit at a table. I'm sort of a snoopy person, and I walked over to the ice cream area where I could get a look at his screen. He was scrolling through some girl's Facebook photos, and she looked very young, like younger than me even. He clicked on pictures of this girl in swimsuits and just stared at them. I was very creeped out and forced myself to ignore it. He eventually left, and once again, I forgot about it and continued working. Just as expected, he came back the very next day. He did everything he usually did, although I spared my eyes from his laptop screen this time. At around 5, he was still just sitting around. He usually would have left by now, and even Kelly noticed it. He came up to the counter, and I quickly walked over to assist him. He requested a cup of boiled water for some strange medication he claimed he was on. We had a hot water machine, but to get it, I'd have to turn around. I didn't want to give him a show, so I backed up, grabbed a cup, and backed over to the machine. He seemed almost dissatisfied that I didn't turn around. I filled it up and walked back over to him and set it down in front of him. As he grabbed the cup, he made the most disgusting comment I've ever had said to me.
"Those leggings look a little tight on you. Are they as tight as they look?"
I didn't even emote, I just stared at him. He chuckled and said that he was just joking and walked back over to his laptop. I went into the back and told Kelly that she needed to kick him out. She refused and said he was just being nice. I got upset with her and walked back out. I was too scared to tell him to leave. He ended up spending the entire day there, and when 10 p.m. rolled around, I grabbed the keys and locked the doors. They're locked from the outside, but you can still open them from the inside. This was usually my way of telling customers to get out in the nicest way possible. This guy didn't move. I brought the sign from outside back in and shut the door. He then piped up and asked what high school I went to. I ignored him and walked behind the counter and shut off a couple of lights to signal that we are very closed. Kelly came out and saw that he was still there, but didn't even try to kick him out. She made small talk with him at the counter and let him sample the ice cream. He offered her some strange white thing that looked a lot like a pill and claimed it was a mint. She declined. I was quietly counting the tips and splitting them, with the tills out. I felt very uncomfortable having our registers out, with this creepy guy hanging around. He didn't make any effort to talk to me, but I overheard the conversation him and Kelly were having. He asked her out, and she said no and that she had a boyfriend. He asked her what school she went to, and she laughed and said she's 22. He said,
"Oh, I thought you were 15.
Kelly didn't laugh at that one. I was incredibly disgusted and grabbed my half of the tips and got my bag. I know I shouldn't have left Kelly there with him, but Kelly didn't take shit from anyone, and she could definitely kick some ass if she wanted to. I said goodbye to Kelly and walked out to my mom's car and told her about the weird guy. My mom doesn't tolerate that shit, so she swerved around and pulled up in the parking lot. She asked if the large white truck was his. I said yes, and she told me to stay in the car. Before she even got out, he came out and saw us. He smiled and waved and started walking over. My mom backed out and drove away and told me that she knows that guy. My mom works at a bank and he's a member. He would constantly try asking her out despite her being married and make inappropriate comments. My mom has a framed picture of me on her desk and customers can see it. He must have seen that and found me on Facebook and learned where I worked. We called the police when we got home and told them about the man. They told us they were looking for him and they would call us back. They found him pretty easily. He was arrested, but not for harassment, but for the fact that he had been banned from the premises for a year and wasn't allowed back yet. So, to the creepy man who stalked both me and my mother, let's hope for your sake that we never meet again. I know a lot of people are going to think this is fake, but I swear it's not. I've got my best friend as a witness. This happened a few years ago when I was about 13. I'm 5'7" and about 125 pounds, so I'm pretty small. I usually have pepper spray and a pocket knife on me. I'm embarrassed to say though, in the excitement of exploration with my best friends, I forgot my pepper spray and knife. I love to explore and travel even, or especially, in places I'm not allowed. So when I moved into my new house, of course, one of the first places I explored were the nearby train tracks. So I had my best friend come over one day to explore the new neighborhood with me, and we decided the train tracks were a perfect place to start. We were walking for an hour or two, and it was still light outside, and we had just passed a small neighborhood street, so we felt safe. At one point, for whatever reason, I turned around, and I saw 5 hooded figures following us about 200 feet away. I don't know how I didn't panic. I just tried to pretend I didn't see them, and calmly told my best friend. He immediately turned around and stared them straight down. Once we looked at them, they stopped. So did my friend and I. We all stared at each other for a few seconds, but it might as well have been hours. Finally, they made their move. 3 of them went left and 2 of them went right. We heard the sound of loud and fast footsteps, so we finally snapped out of our trance and ran as fast as we could. We were both in cross country, and that paired with our adrenaline, we ran faster than we ever had before. Luckily, I'd explored those same tracks and knew them fairly well. We ran a half-mile up to a bridge that led to a small neighborhood. We somehow made it, with no idea if we were still being followed or not. We continued running until we got to my neighborhood, and didn't feel safe until we were around other people. We slowed our pace and walked home, shaking and exhausted. Looking back now, I regret not telling my parents, but I was scared they wouldn't let me explore alone anymore. But I didn't go on those train tracks again, and I don't think I ever will. I've always wanted to share this story. I've decided to use an old throwaway account since I usually just lurk. I have no real way of proving my credibility, but if you've ever visited or live in a rural part of South Asia, you can probably vouch for me in saying that it's a lot more plausible than one might assume. My mom was born and raised in the UK, but she is of South Asian descent And since I'm mixed, she tries really hard to make sure I'm in touch with my culture. This meant that, as a child, we would make a lot of frequent visits back home. Every summer I can remember was spent there, and then it suddenly just stopped after this incident. My mom's family back home live in an extremely rural part of the country. There's a lot of poverty surrounding our family home, so we rarely left our relatively nice part of the village. I was never allowed out to explore, and coming from the concrete jungle that is London, I was always so curious. I was 8 at the time. One of my uncles from a neighboring village would often visit with his children, and when they did, my mom would let me go with them to a small hut-like shop that sold sweets and snacks, like 15 minutes away from the family home. My cousins were 11 and 19 and both male, and it was broad daylight. To get to the shop, we walked through a small do-it-yourself road, and on both sides is what I would call the jungle. It was basically just a lot of trees and bushes as far as you could see. You can't really see anything beyond the trees. It's just a lot of greenery. I'm mixed with East Asian. I definitely get my looks from my dad's side. So being an obvious foreigner in a rural part of back home meant that I was pretty used to strangers staring and asking me questions. I was also used to creepy men that would tell me I was beautiful because I had pale skin. My mom warned me about these men and made sure I knew to stay away from them. So, the road to the hut was paved with creepy people making creepy comments, and my cousins basically telling them to leave me alone, in less than pleasant terms. There was also a group of young guys. Some of them had motorbikes, and some were just chilling. One of them waved at me. He seemed friendly enough, so I just waved back and went about my day. Once we got to the hut, we immediately started losing our self-control with the snacks. The owner was super friendly, and he let us try a bunch of the sweet mishtis he had, and he also had coffee ice cream for the first time. I distinctly remember being really excited because my mom and aunts loved coffee ice cream, so I thought it would be a nice surprise for them. I asked for 3, and the nice guy gave me 4, so my hands were full and they were quickly melting, and he told me to run, to go home quickly. I told my cousins I would get a running start, and once they finished, they could catch up. I would still be in their line of sight, plus it was daytime and it was a busy road. I start running back. There were a few older aunties that stood at the top of the road, and something about their presence gave me a sense of security. I felt a lot safer knowing they were there, and paired with the fact that my cousins were able to see me clearly, I felt comfortable enough to just walk back leisurely, minding my business and eating my ice cream. I passed back by the group of guys, and the one that waved at me came over. He said,
"You're X's niece, right?"
X being my uncle, and he jokingly took one of my ice creams and said,
"She got an ice cream for Mama."
Mama means uncle in our language, and so I just assumed he was a friend of my uncle's. He asked me when I arrived, and how I was liking the country. He was so friendly, and he didn't look like the stereotypical creep. When I said I was going to go home, he said,
"Why don't you let your uncle take you? You can ride on my motorbike."
I think that's when something clicked in my mind, that maybe he wasn't the friendly uncle I thought he was. That's also when I realized I was pretty much circled in and surrounded by the group of men. It's also when I realized that I could no longer see my cousins or the group of old ladies at the top of the road, which also meant they probably couldn't see me. I wish I could explain in words how helpless and afraid I was. I had all the threats in the world explained to me by my mom in a country where I knew I was vulnerable and had to be cautious, and I still managed to find myself in a dangerous situation. Luckily, my cousins came running and shouting, and the guys ran off into the jungle. When we told my family what happened, I was basically put on house arrest, and my mom refused to let me out of her sight. I was pretty shook up about the whole situation, and so, honestly, I was kind of grateful for that. I put it down to my paranoia, but at the time, I would get overwhelming feelings of being watched. Our village is quite small, like amongst them, it's an everyone knows everyone sort of thing. My uncle is also a big community figure, and he's very well known amongst the villagers, which is why the men probably put two and two together that I was his niece. Having foreign family over is usually a pretty big deal, and having a niece that is mixed race is also a very big deal. I'm sure the word got around. He realized that there were a group of men on motorbikes that would frequently go past our house. They stayed a decent distance from our home though, and that they weren't anyone that he knew. It's creepy to think about now, the lengths they were going to. A couple of days before we were due to fly back, I had my second, last, and worst encounter with this particular friendly uncle. It was night, and it was like every other night when we would play board games or card games in the front room. Because it was so hot, I went to my bedroom, and I was playing on my Nintendo DS. I know, what a throwback. When I saw, out of the corner of my eye, someone at the window, staring directly at me. It was him. The worst part is he had the most creepy, sick and twisted smile I've ever seen. He put a finger to his lips, but I did the literal opposite and started screaming hysterically. I had been on edge since the ice cream incident, so what might seem like an overreaction was just my natural response. I can't really tell you what happened next because no one has ever told me. My uncle and his friends are not known to be the friendliest people, but I was told he was dealt with and he would never bother me again. We recently received a wedding film from one of my cousin's weddings, and part of the film was her leaving to get to the venue, and I noticed that the jungle was no longer there. It had basically been cut down. For the first time, I could see beyond the greenery. That's when my mom explained to me that my uncle had it cut down not long after that particular visit because of what they called the Headcutters. My entire life, I've wondered what would happen to me if I'd got on that motorbike, but now I know with reasonable certainty what his intentions were. During that time, a gang had been kidnapping beggar children. It took a while for the village to realize because it's not unusual for beggar children to go missing. When we were there, people were vaguely aware that it was becoming a trend. A couple of months later, a head was found. It became known in our village, but people tried to keep it quiet to avoid getting a bad name. The problem went away once a lot of the greenery was cut down, so there was nowhere left to hide. But it's also when they realized the magnitude of what had happened. The weird thing is, I've known about the Headcutters for a while. I knew it was something that had occurred in our village, but for some reason, until recently, I never put two and two together. But now that I have, I often think about what nearly happened to me. But more importantly, what happened to a handful of children in our little village. I think about the fact that, beyond our relatively small circle, no one thinks about them, and no one is haunted by their deaths. So, creepy uncle with the motorbike, let's not meet again. And I hope no one has the misfortune of meeting you ever again. My girlfriend and I experienced a crazy night on March the 24th of this year. She was pregnant and craving Chinese. Our usual Chinese food parlor was closed due to COVID-19, so I found a Chinese restaurant that was doing orders to go. It was 20 miles away, close to the countryside. On the way back, we were laughing and joking when the car behind us turned its brights on. It was an old green SUV. At that point, I couldn't see the driver. When passing by us, I saw two guys wearing masks. When I say mask, you probably automatically assume Halloween masks. These guys were wearing large metal masks, very raw and rusty. Just masks and no shirts. The passenger had his window opened. He threatened us with some type of weapon. I don't know what it was. It looked like a long stick with a blade on the bottom. I watched the news intently for a week after this to see if the cops stumbled upon them, but got nothing. I still think about this on a weekly basis.